Graduation season's arrived, and for President Obama, and it's his final chance to really speak to graduating seniors, certainly as president, and he's not taking the task lightly. Now, over the weekend, the president was a commencement speaker at RUTGERS. That is, the university celebrated its 250th anniversary. Obama took the chance to take a swipe, and not too imperceptibly, by the way, at Donald Trump, repeatedly talking about the importance of globalization and how interconnected the world is, noted frequently in the speech that walls will do more harm than good and that isolationism will not work in 2016. But the president's biggest point was his pushback against Trump and others who dismiss fact over anger and style.
Facts, evidence, reason, logic, an understanding of science, these are good things. These are qualities you want in people making policy. These are qualities you want to continue to cultivate in yourselves as citizens. So class of 2016, let me be as clear as I can be. In politics and in life, ignorance is not a virtue. It's not cool to not know what you're talking about. That's not keeping it real or telling it like it is.
Now, for this conversation, we welcome Barry Pearson to the panel. Barry is the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Purchase College, which is in the SUNY school system. As you know, Barry, good talking as always. By the way, can you breathe yet? We got the...
Yeah, just a little bit.
You can, all right,
yeah,
good.
A couple of days off and we're back at it. So,
you know, we'll get into what's changing on college campuses, certainly in the last 10 years, about who gets disinvited to speak in a second. So rather than the choice of the speaker, the messaging of the speaker, clearly in this case the president saying intellectualism is not the enemy. It's not a bad thing to know things. I've always told an example. I had a late grandfather who drove a bus and a trolley, but he would read 2 newspapers every day before he'd go to work. I know people now, forgetting whether they're blue or white collar, who'll throw out opinions without knowing anything and proudly will say they don't need to read about it because they got a gut to know what they're talking about. We've seen it on the campaign trail a little bit too. It's different, and I'm curious from your perspective, and yours too, Jeannie, on the college campuses, if intellectualism is seen as something to be looked down on now or not.
well, I think we're always encouraging our students to take the high road in any of these issues, which is to be critical, to think deeply, and to not trust a single source. Meaning sometimes our students want to, you know, like all of us, have a bias, and they tend to shade their reading and their critical thinking towards that bias. I think the real issue is how do we help our students remain open to multiple views? And my concern often on college campuses is not what they're reading, but who else are they reading? And who else are they thinking about? And how do we encourage that dialogue in such a way that by the time they get to a commencement speaker, they expect somebody who might be a little controversial.
Yeah.
And our students might be comfortable with that.
You don't have to agree with everything you hear.
Right.
You found the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, and to the provost's point, I think one thing we always struggle with is with the new technology, it's increasingly easy for all of us to pick and choose what we read, right? So we can say, oh, I'm interested in X, and every day I'm going to get input from this source and close myself off to everything else. And I think for me, as new generations of students come in, it's increasingly hard. You know, when I started teaching in political science, we would always require everybody to buy the New York Times or the Washington Times or the Washington, whatever it was. And now nobody reads hard copies. So now we say, you know, go online and read the newspaper. But that's a very different experience because there you can choose what comes into you.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge challenge for us in academia, how we deal with the new technology issues, which make opening students up to varying ideas and thoughts, as the provost mentioned, is really tough.
And facts seem so fungible now. Where like it used to be, there it is. Oh no, there's different theories about everything and like different facts about everything. I'm like, no. Anyway, you know, Andrew, in listening to the president, in many ways, I think it crystallized for a guy who can communicate as well as he can. One of the frustrations of his administration, which was he's been perceived by certainly his critics as this elitist intellectual. and he's an academic, and he's not the go by his gut kind of guy. And I think we're going to hear, as Dominic says, when the book comes out, that he had higher aspirations in terms of the dialogues that we could have. Maybe he misread his audience, but I think in many ways you heard it there, which is it's not just enough to pull a Palin and say, you betcha. There should be some facts behind it. Maybe he didn't deliver it as well as he would have liked. I'm talking about the speech. I'm talking about the 8 years.
I don't know if you can put that on him. I think he wound up in the environment where, it's unbelievable to me that intellectualism has become a negative in a lot of camps.
Yeah.
We're seeing that on the campaign trail, and so that was not a particularly veiled reference to Donald Trump, but it could have been the birther issue. It could have been the death panels that we heard about during the Obamacare debates. And you see it increasingly all over the place. When we were choosing healthcare in this company, the questions that I got from people who had no intellectual curiosity about what their research was supposed to be or what their decision was supposed to be. I don't know if it's a generational thing. I don't know if my parents' generation would have looked at us and said the same thing, but it's...
Or even when you get shots, as you get inoculated, people feel that it's a valid position to say across the board that, this is poison or whatever else, and it's like, well, what about the AMA or whatever else? Oh, that's a shell,
or climate
and you're
change.
shocked at who says
Climate
these things.
change.
All right. There was also, one weekend prior, the president gave a commencement address at Howard University. I meant to talk about it on the show, but it got away with us with the news cycle last week. He used the chance to talk to students at the predominantly black university about what he sees as requirements for the next generation of African American adults.
We have to not only question the world as it is and stand up for those African Americans who haven't been so lucky. Because yes, you've worked hard, but you've also been lucky. But we must also expand our moral imaginations to understand and empathize with all people who are struggling. Not just black folks who are struggling. The refugee, the immigrant, the rural poor, the transgender person. And yes, the middle-aged white guy who you may think has all the advantages, but over the last several decades has seen his world upended by economic and cultural and technological change and feels powerless to stop it.
Every time you think you know exactly where he's coming from on stuff, where we'd seen simmering frustration. In the last year, he used some comedy, where he used Key or Peele. I forget one of the guys to say his Luther, what was his
anger translator.
His anger translator and all the rest. And that's there, certainly. He feels he's been treated different than any other president because of his name and skin or whatever. But also, if you listen to that address, he was telling these folks, stop playing the victim card as much as you think. It's not going to do us any good at a certain point. It's better now than it was before, as much as some people like to say otherwise. I was a little surprised by some of the tone there. He's a complicated guy to figure out.
What I heard, Richard, was that was just regurgitated from Jesse Jackson, 1988. Back in the 88 campaign, Jackson said exactly the same thing. Embrace Appalachia, embrace the people of Colorado, the Rainbow Coalition. It's exactly the same thing. What I heard from that speech at Howard University, it's just amazing how we all interpret things differently. What I heard was be proud to be African American. And that's a message that needs to go out, particularly to these kids coming from this predominantly black school about to go into a white workforce for the most part.
Do you think in 15 years he'll be revered in the black community? We always say history judges presidents sometimes better with time when they look at all the contributing factors. Obviously, historical figure. How do you think he'll be judged? Harsher or more forgivingly, at least as it relates with the African American community?
I think the black community, let's remember, he wasn't cool with the black community in the beginning. They were very lukewarm to him, and they were down with Hillary Clinton. And then Sharpton and all the others got on board and it changed. History, particularly with blacks, will look back and judge him in a very favorable way. This administration He has not been good at talking up his own accomplishments. And history looks more favorable, as you just said, down the road. So I think black folks will be very proud of this president.
We'll talk commencements. When we come back, we're going to stay on that subject. A lot of students, they're not hearing the words of speakers their schools originally selected. They didn't want to hear from them. So why are so many speakers now seemingly unwelcome at so many universities? And where's that line between political correctness and closed-mindedness? We'll ask our guest that after this.